Number 9. Kara Nichols. In October 2012, Kara Nichols was 19 years old when she went missing in Colorado Springs. She was supposedly on her way to Denver for a modeling job when she left her laptop, phone charger, and other items at her apartment. She also stopped answering her phone, which went straight to voicemail. Detectives determined Kara had been advertising herself as an escort around the time of her disappearance. Her phone last pinged at an address belonging to the parents of a man named Joel Hollendorfer, who claimed he sought Kara's services, but that they never actually met that night. The case remained cold for years until Hollendorfer's ex-wife Christina told detectives Joel had confessed to killing an escort and burying her body in a grave on his parents' land. She believed his parents were just covering for him. Finally, the FBI got a warrant to once again search the property earlier this year, and this time they found Kara's remains. The coroner determined someone had strangled her. Hollendorfer, who's now 46 years old, now faces a second-degree murder charge in connection to the young woman's death. His preliminary hearing is set for September 17th this year. Number 8. James Bergstrom. For years during the 1980s and 90s, James Bergstrom terrorized women in Texas and Washington state, while he had a wife named Linda at home. He started out as a peeping Tom during his career as a naval mariner before he started invading his victims' homes and brutally assaulting them. From the outside looking in, Bergstrom didn't strike anyone as the usual subject for this kind of crime, which is probably why he got away with it for so long. By all appearances, he seemed like the average middle-class suburban husband. But the signs eventually started to show, and even Linda began to suspect Bergstrom was up to something. James spent a lot of time outside the house during strange hours, claiming he was going jogging, and he started to become increasingly brazen in his attacks, prompting police to be on careful lookout. Police even arrested him at one point, but lacked enough evidence to pursue a case against him. The assaults continued, and as dozens of women and young girls had their lives turned upside down, it seemed like Bergstrom would get away with his sickening actions forever. At one point, Linda found some supplies in his car that he used for the attacks, including weapons, a ski mask, and duct tape. Terrified at what her husband would do if she reported him, but no longer able to keep quiet, she went to the police and agreed to help them in any way she could. Around the same time, one of Bergstrom's victims identified him, and his reign of terror finally ended. He victimized at least 15 women over a 2-year period, but the actual number is thought to be much higher. Bergstrom is eligible for parole, but has been denied so far. He has a release date set for 2091, but those who have been affected by his actions are hoping he remains locked up for the rest of his life. Linda recently went on the show Evil Lives Here and publicly shared her experience for the first time. Number 7. Private John Lambert. In 2016, construction workers found the remains of at least 60 soldiers in a farmer's field in Belgium. It would take over 3 years for one set of the bones to be identified as Private John Lambert, a Canadian soldier who fought with the Royal Newfoundland Regiment during the First World War. CBC reported that identifying Lambert's remains was one of the most complicated cases the country's Department of National Defence had ever been tasked with. Anthropologist Sarah Lockyer told the news outlet that Lambert, who was 17 when he entered the war, was the youngest soldier she had ever positively identified. During the interview, she commented that he looked like a child in his photos, and that she found his youthful appearance striking when opening his file. Lambert's surviving relatives said he lied about his age to join the war effort at 16 years old. The military sent his father a handwritten letter the following year when he died in combat. But the man's descendants remained curious about what happened to his remains, or if they were ever found, until they were finally identified over a century later. Lambert was fatally wounded in a British attack on the Germans, known as the Battle of Langemarck. He died with 3 other British soldiers whose remains would later be found. Researchers learned that Lambert was one of 16 men from his regiment that went missing during the battle, and narrowed down their options from there with the help of DNA samples from living relatives. The discovery has brought long-awaited closure to Lambert's family, who travelled to Belgium to see where his remains were found, and to see him finally laid to rest in peace at a war cemetery. Number 6. Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee CUEVAS. In May 1987, someone viciously assaulted 23-year-old Shannon Rose Lloyd, strangling her to death at her apartment in Garden Grove, California. Only 2 years later, 27-year-old Renee CUEVAS was murdered in the same county. Her body was found near the El Toro Marine Base in Irvine. It wasn't until 2003 that detectives linked the murders to the same killer, thanks to advancing DNA technology. At the time, the person's DNA was unavailable to law enforcement's database, known as CODIS. More recently, with the use of a groundbreaking technique called genetic genealogy, the investigation led to Reuben J. Smith in Las Vegas. At the time the women were killed, he was living in Orange County, and in 1998 he had been forced to provide his DNA in connection to the suspected assault and attempted murder of a different woman. Instead of facing accountability for his actions, Smith took his own life the following year, at 39 years old. It wasn't until last year, when investigators used genetic genealogy, that the connections were made between Smith and the murders of Lloyd and CUEVAS. This method of catching criminals has led to multiple cold cases getting solved in recent years, including serial murderers who got away with their crimes for decades before getting caught. It works by tracing an unknown culprit's DNA through their family members, and is now giving devoted detectives an opportunity to bring killers to justice while there's still time. Number 5. The Somerton Man. One evening in 1948, a couple found a man propped up against a seawall at a beach in Adelaide, Australia. He was dressed professionally, but was weak and disoriented. Just assuming he was drunk, they left him to sort out his own issues. He was later found dead in the same place the next day. An autopsy determined he didn't die of natural causes, and while his body showed signs of poisoning, no actual poison was found inside his system. All the man's clothing tags had been removed. His pockets had a few items, including 2 bus tickets and a strange scrap of paper that said, "Tamam shud," a Persian phrase that translates to, "it is ended," but detectives found no wallet or ID. The book the slip of paper was ripped out of eventually turned up. It had the phone number of a woman who admitted to giving someone a copy of the book years earlier, but that recipient was still alive and well. The woman also claimed an unknown man had come looking for her when she wasn't home about a year before. She denied knowing the dead man, but became visibly startled when shown a photograph of him, as if she knew more than she was saying. Whether the incident has any connection to the case is unclear, but genetic genealogists have finally identified John Doe as an electrical engineer from Melbourne named Carl Charles Webb. The circumstances surrounding his death and how he ended up there on the beach still remain a mystery, but by determining who he was in the first place, experts have come a long way towards solving this decades-old case, and they expect more answers will follow as they continue piecing the mysterious puzzle together. Number 4. THERESA Caroline Fillinghim. THERESA Caroline Fillinghim was just 17 years old when her sister reported her missing in Tampa, Florida, back in 1980. Her whereabouts remained a mystery until just recently, when her remains were positively identified years after being found. In 1981, police discovered the remains of 4 people in a junkyard in Spring Hill, put there by a serial killer named Billy Mansfield Jr., who was already spending his life in prison for the crimes he's been convicted of. But at the time, they were only able to identify 2 of the individual's remains. Over the years, Fillingham's bones were sent to multiple DNA labs that were unable to develop a profile until 2020. Even then, THERESA's identity remained a mystery since no matches turned up in the national DNA database. Using a technique called snapshot DNA phenotyping, detectives searched for a possible victim using a description of her features instead of an exact genetic match. It led them to THERESA Fillingham, and a DNA sample from her sister confirmed their suspicions. Fillingham's sister, Margaret Johns, told local news station WFLA that the discovery has brought peace to her and THERESA's brother, but it's still unfortunate their parents and one of their siblings died without knowing what happened to the young woman. Number 3. Maria Ridulph. 7-year-old Maria Ridulph was kidnapped in Sycamore, Illinois on December 3, 1957. According to a witness, she was last seen with a man in his 20s who called himself Johnny. There are different accounts of the interactions that happened, but they all end with Maria and the man vanishing. Her remains were found 5 months later in a wooded area about 100 miles, 161 kilometers, from where she was taken. With the limited technology available during the 1950s and the advanced state of decomposition that Maria's remains were found in, medical examiners were unable to determine her cause of death. In 2011, her remains were exhumed, and experts concluded she had been fatally stabbed in the throat. Ever since Maria's disappearance, the family's neighbor, John Tessier, had been a suspect in the crime. Several young girls in the neighborhood accused him of doing inappropriate things, and he even admitted to some. But detectives had little to go on in Maria's case, so he remained a free man. 11 days after she vanished, Tessier changed his name to John McCulloch, supposedly to avoid negative publicity from the case, and joined the military. In 1994, the man's mother told his sister on her deathbed that Tessier had killed Ridulph. After grappling with what she knew for so many years, the sister finally came forward to authorities in 2008. McCulloch was convicted of Maria's murder in 2012 when he was 71 years old. It was one of the oldest cold cases to ever go to trial in the US. To everyone's surprise, the case wasn't over. In 2016, McCulloch was exonerated based on phone records that proved he was far from the crime scene when Maria was taken. While new leads have popped up in the years since, it's unclear whether authorities are close to solving this 65-year-old murder for the second time. Number 2. Lindy Sue BIECHLER. 19-year-old Lindy Sue BIECHLER was found stabbed to death in her home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, back in 1975. Someone had plunged a knife into her body 19 times. She was found covered in defensive wounds as well. Investigators spent decades looking for leads, only to come up empty-handed and no closer to finding the young woman's killer. Lancaster County's oldest cold case is finally one step closer to being solved, thanks to new sophisticated DNA technology, which led detectives to a 68-year-old man named David Sinopoli. Before the findings were made, Sinopoli was never even considered a possible suspect in the case. Law enforcement needed solid evidence before they could arrest him. They obtained a sample of Sinopoli's DNA from a coffee cup he threw away at an airport before catching a flight, and it turned out to be a match to Lindy's killer. Sitting in jail on a homicide charge without bail is probably the last place Sinopoli expected to end up more than 50 years after killing BIECHLER, but that's where he currently is while he waits for his next court date. Number 1. Little Miss Nobody. On July 21, 1960, 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos was abducted by a couple behind her grandmother's house in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Children who were playing nearby at the time said a woman offered to buy Sharon some new clothes and candy, and when the little girl said no, the culprits dragged her into a dirty green car and just drove off. 10 days later, a little girl's remains were found 500 miles, 805 kilometers away in Yavapai County, Arizona. The body was incredibly decomposed, making it difficult for authorities to know much about the individual it belonged to. They believed she was around 7 years old, but had no clue how she died or who she even was. Due to the age discrepancy, the girl was ruled out as being Sharon Gallegos. In 2015, the remains of Little Miss Nobody were exhumed in hopes scientists could find her DNA profile. The technology wasn't quite there at the time of her death, but experts have recently determined that the body did in fact belong to Sharon Gallegos. While this solves a crucial part of the mystery, law enforcement is still working to figure out who could be responsible for the girl's kidnapping and death. Thanks for watching. Have you heard of any other interesting cold cases? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.